Chapter 8 of Brother I'm Dying, titled The Return. One afternoon in October 1976, when I was 7 years old, Bob, Nick, and I were sitting on my uncle's front gallery memorizing, just like every other school child in Haiti, our usual rote lessons for the next school day, when we saw some strange figures turn the corner from Rue Tiramisu and head down the alley toward us. One was a man in a brown three-piece suit that looked like it was getting its first wear. He was carrying a briefcase in one hand and grasping a boy's elbow with the other. A plump woman followed with a baby in her arms. Immediately trailing them was a taxi driver and a few other young men who carried 4 large suitcases up the gallery and set them at our feet. The first thing I noticed when I looked up from their outsized, outstretched luggage was the man's smile. It was huge, cavernous, 2 of his top front teeth golden. "Edwish, it's Papa," he said, pressing that extensive smile against the side of my face. He smelled of a cologne whose fragrance I could recognize of travel and faraway places. Was he really my father, I wondered? This thin, happy man with a thick, dark beard that caressed his collarbone when he lowered his head? He kept his eyes on me, letting them wander for only a few seconds while he reached into his pocket to pay the driver and the young men who'd helped with the bags. Until that moment, aside from the butter cookies and the restrained words of his letters, my father had mostly been a feeling for me, powerful yet vague, without a real face, a real body, like the one looming over the pecan-hued little boy who was looking up at Nick, Bob, and me. Edwish? My mother stepped onto the front porch, plugging the remaining hole in the circle that was now all of us. "Come and kiss your mama," she said. She looked heavier than I remembered, and her copper-colored skin was a few shades lighter. The baby in her arms was sleeping. "Maman?" Bob's jaw dropped. He ran to her and planted a kiss on the first place his lips reached on her body, the woolen plaid skirt covering her legs. Balancing the baby with one arm, she reached down with her other hand and stroked his head gently, softly, for a long time. He in turn remained glued to her skirt, burying his face deep into it, as though he were crying and didn't want the rest of us to see. I thought he had forgotten her. She'd left when he was 2, the age I was when my father left. Yet whatever was drawing him to her, yearning, pain, curiosity, was keeping me away from him. "Bob!" My father reached over and gently pulled him away. Bob turned to my father's lowered face and kissed his cheek. My father was pleased, rubbing Bob's head with his palm. "This is your brother Kelly," my father said, introducing him to the little boy by their side. It was thanks to Kelly that our parents had been able to return to Haiti. Even though they had overstayed tourist visas, Kelly's birth in the United States had instantly made them eligible for permanent residency, which is no longer possible today. Before things were finalized, however, they had to file the paperwork at the consulate in Port-au-Prince. Only then could they petition for Bob and me to join them in New York. "Any grandma here?" my father asked, gently patting my shoulder with his hand. It was late afternoon, the near dinner hour. The water women had just filled up their buckets at the municipal tap near the Lycée Petit-Champ and were calling out in a sing-song that we sometimes listened for when our supply was low. "Load, load, load, pour vin. I have water for sale." At the turn where the alley curved toward the street, Boniface, the blacksmith, was hammering an old oil drum into a thin sheet of metal that he would then mold into a metal wreath to sell at the cemetery. 2 of the Pradel brothers were taking turns reciting their lessons out loud in a unified refrain. 2 others were playing an impromptu soccer game on their parents' front porch with an empty carnation milk can. Their maid, a girl younger than all of them, began burning her weekly accumulation of trash, suddenly filling the alley with rank white smoke. My parents walked inside the house to avoid the smoke. Guided by Bob and Nick, my father shut the jalousies and piled his suitcases next to the few living room chairs. Tante Nice was cooking supper and Uncle Joseph lying down for a nap. I told Bob to go and get her, then I rushed to the room where my uncle lay curled on his side, bare-chested. He was startled when I shook him and thrust at him a shirt that was laid out on his night table. "My father and mother are here," I said. He looked at me as though I'd grown 2 heads. Still, he quickly got dressed and followed me. "Frem!" My father ran into my uncle's arms. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" my uncle said. They remained attached for a while, intertwined, as if one might never release the other. Stepping away first, my father left an imprint of his wet face on the front of my uncle's shirt. "Mes frères," my father said. "Thank you for looking after my children." "Mira," my uncle said, laughing. Mira was my father's nickname, short for Mirasin, his middle name. I learned what everyone called him. These children almost look after themselves. Tante Denise ran out of the kitchen, and though uncharacteristically joyful, she still scolded my mother with a wagging finger for not having warned her they were coming. My father asked Bob and Nick to go buy him a pack of cigarettes, and they hurried off to a street stand, happy to have so big a job to do. "Come," my mother said, patting the chair next to hers. She smelled like coconut, which I eventually figured out came from her hair pomade. Her voice, clipped, quick, had slowly been fading from my memory. I wanted to lean over and place my head on her arm, just as I had in the back of the car the day she left, but I was too shy to do it. The baby had woken up, his round face creased and crumpled. "His name is Carl," she said, "and he's 2 months old." Looking down at Carl, snugly cradled in our mother's arms, I couldn't help but feel envious. If she could bring him here from New York, why hadn't she been able to take Bob and me with her when she left? At the same time, I could tell that the way she stopped now and then to run her fingers over both his face and mine, that she meant him to be a link between us. "Can I hold him a little?" I asked. Not used to holding babies then, I was shocked when she leaned over and actually placed his doughy, wriggling little body in my arms. Our extended family gathered quickly as news of my parents' arrival spread. Crowding the living room were my father's sisters, Tante Z and Tante Tina, Tante Denise's brothers, George and Bosie, Marie Micheline, and 2-year-old Ruth, who, along with Kelly, skipped and hopped and crawled between our legs. Dragging on a cigarette, my father sprinted around and beamed at everyone, family members, including my aunts, and even strangers who saw my father during that visit tell me they'd found his charm magnetic and contagious, almost like a movie star or a politician. But then again, my father would later tell me it was easy to be charming when you returned home on a trip that you'd been dreaming about, practicing and rehearsing in your mind for years. Even the cigarette was like a prop in a play. He was an actor playing the part of someone who wished he wasn't a factory worker or a taxi driver. That night, between cigarettes, my father recounted New York to us. "What does snow feel like?" Tante Denise's oldest brother George asked. My father didn't talk about how cold and damp snow could be, or how slippery and dangerous it could become when gelled and frozen. He didn't talk about the beauty of the individual flakes, or how a few feet of them could look like a pasty rug over a lumpy bed. The only thing that we have to compare it to, he simply said, was hail. "I hear it can be just as dangerous in New York," Tante Denise's older brother Bosie said. "As dangerous as it can be with the Macouse here." This led my father into 2 urban legends from New York's Haitian community. A woman was robbed weekly by a masked young man in the elevator of her apartment building. One day she carried a kitchen knife, which she used to stab her robber. When she removed the thief's mask, she realized it was her son. In the other story, a young man had led some school pals to $5,000 that his mother was hiding in a mattress, and in a struggle for the money, the mother had been shot. My father told these stories as though he'd seen them happen in the elevator, in the bedroom. As he spoke, his audience gasped in awe and fear, in admiration of his pluck. "New York, like today's Haiti," he said, while bouncing a tired-looking Kelly on his lap, "is a place where only the brave survive." My father yawned, reminding us that he, my mother, and Kelly and Carl had an appointment at the American consulate early the next morning. Dressed for bed, I wondered whether Bob and I would be excused from our usual sleeping arrangements, he with Nick and me with Liline, to bunk with our prodigal family. But there wasn't enough space. In one of the spare rooms, my father and Kelly were already sharing a cot, so my mother and Carl could have a bed to themselves. I waited until everyone else in the house was in bed before going in to say good night. Walking on the tips of my toes, I rapped softly on the door so I wouldn't wake the baby. My mother was already asleep with Carl at her side. Before my mother had left us, one night she and Bob dozed off together in the bed, tucked tightly against each other, just as she and Carl were now. This was my first experience of nearly heart-shattering jealousy. There was only my father to say goodnight to now, and Kelly, whose eyes were barely open, his super long eyelashes batting between wakefulness and sleep. Fearing the wiry hairs on my father's prickly beard, I closed my eyes when I kissed his cheek, and even as he pulled me into his arms and poked at my ribs and tried to make me laugh, I was still certain that I would open my eyes and he'd be gone. The next morning my parents left for the consulate at dawn. As Bob, Nick, and I ate our breakfast, the house seemed strangely empty, void of their sudden but now vital presences. Fidgeting on the edge of his seat, Bob said, "Maman and Papa had an appointment. They'll be back." "Be quiet," I ordered. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know," he said. His mouth curled up and he looked like he was going to cry. I can imagine him announcing to the other children in his class that his parents, who his classmates knew were living in New York, had come back. He didn't seem to understand that they'd not come to stay. Returning from school, we found my father sitting in the living room next to my uncle, and the two of them sifting through a handful of pictures from their mother's funeral. Grandma Lorvana had died soon after everyone had moved to Bel Air and was the first member of our family to be buried outside of Beausejour. Hers was our clan's first funeral procession, with hired musicians trailing her hearse as it crept toward a newly constructed city mausoleum. In their mother's funeral pictures, my father, mustached and youthful, was photographed standing next to the brand new mausoleum with his brothers and sisters. "Look at this one." My father held out one of the pictures to my uncle, suddenly reminding me of the way Bob and I sometimes sought my uncle's attention. For most of my father's life, my uncle had been more a parental than fraternal figure. With 12 years between them, in his time, my uncle liked to say, a 12-year-old was already a man. Neither one of them had any memory of ever playing together. When my father was born, my uncle had been too busy studying, working, and doing his best to help look after the family. "How was school?" my uncle asked, looking up from the pictures at Bob and me. "How was it?" echoed my father. Bob walked over, ignoring my uncle completely, and jumped on my father's lap. "Okay, I'm not going to forget this," teased my uncle. I leaned over and kissed them both on the cheek, making sure, after my brother's slight, to kiss my uncle first. As I did this, my father reached into his pants pocket and handed Bob a fistful of American pennies. Some of the copper coins were bright and new, others older and darker. As my brother tried to balance them in his small hand, many of the pennies slipped and fell to the floor, rolling into unseen corners under the sofas and chairs. Weeks, months after my father had left, I would find his pennies all throughout the house, in sunken corners of the living room floor, between the mattresses on the cot where he slept. Before deciding what to do with them, I would drape pieces of white paper over them and trace the outline of the man on one side, a man with a beard just like my father's. Once they'd been granted their residency papers, my parents planned to stay another week, but they had to cut their trip short when both Kelly and Carl got sick with diarrhea. My uncle took them to the neighborhood clinic where Marie Micheline worked as the head nurse. The doctor there advised my parents to quickly take the boys back to their own doctors in the United States. This time at the airport, my mother looked anxious as she clutched a fidgety Carl to her chest. Walking to the outdoor staircase leading to the plane, my father made Kelly wave toward the second-floor patio where Uncle Joseph, Tante Denise, and Bob and I were standing. At the airplane's entrance, my mother adjusted Carl in her arms and freed one of her hands to wave back. They hadn't told us anything. Would they be back? Would we be joining them? We were never told things directly, I thought, even then. That would imply that we had a say when we really had none. At the airport, I thought I might cry, throw another tantrum as I did the first time my mother left. But I didn't, and neither did Bob. We were much older now, and were more accustomed to being without them than being with them. At least, I remember thinking, we had seen them again.